Hello everyone. Tonight we are stepping quietly into the shadowy chambers of medieval life, a world ruled by candles, silence, and secrets stitched into every hemline. Imagine this. You're standing in a dim stone hallway. The air smells faintly of tallow and damp wool, and from behind heavy wooden doors come muffled voices, hushed, private, very much not meant for the ears of outsiders. You're not supposed to be here, but here you are. We're going to talk about women. Not queens in textbooks or saints in stained glass, the ones whose stories were usually erased, or worse, never written down to begin with. Their lives revolved around rules, expectations, and invisible lines that, if crossed, could ruin everything. And in the middle of it all, sex. Controlled, feared, desired, and constantly judged. And let me warn you, you probably won't survive medieval morality. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. You shuffle into the average medieval home, mud floor, smoky hearth, a goat staring judgmentally from the corner. There's a woman stirring pottage with one hand and keeping a baby from rolling into the fire with the other. She hasn't bathed in weeks, but neither has anyone else. She is a wife, and more importantly, she is a respectable wife. That word, respectable, meant everything. Medieval women's lives were divided by two brutal gates, virginity and marriage. Before the wedding bed, a girl's job was to be pure. After, it was to obey. Between those 2 points, almost no freedom, and certainly no forgiveness. You think behind closed doors means privacy? Not in the 12th century. Privacy didn't exist. Peasant families often shared one-room huts. Multiple generations slept on straw together. If sex happened, it happened quietly, or not at all. The shame of being heard was real, and yet no one had anywhere else to go. The church said sex was only for procreation, but couples still snuck in moments of passion. A whisper, a touch under blankets, maybe a stolen laugh if they were lucky, and if a woman wasn't married, her body became public property for comment, speculation, or worse. Town gossips were vicious. A girl who got pregnant before marriage was either forced to wed in shame or banished. Some were simply gone, sent to convents, or left to beg. That phrase, fallen woman? Yeah, that's where it started. Here's a true historical fact. In some areas of medieval England, unmarried pregnant women were forced to wear special clothing, literally marked, while working in the fields. Think of it as the world's earliest walk of shame, just without the camera phones. And don't think noblewomen had it easier. Sure, they lived in castles instead of cottages, but those castles were social prisons. Girls were often betrothed before puberty. Their marriages were sealed with political contracts, not affection. And the consummation? That was often arranged too. Some families even brought witnesses to the bedroom. Yeah, witnesses. That's your medieval honeymoon. Room full of strangers, maybe a priest, maybe your mother-in-law, all silently hoping to see a stained sheet by morning. And if they didn't? Well, maybe you faked it with animal blood. Chicken blood was popular, rabbits too. The weird fact you didn't ask for. In some households, people believed hanging a weasel's testicles around a woman's neck would prevent pregnancy. Yes, really. And no, I'm not suggesting you try it. There were also terrifying superstitions. It was widely believed a woman could conceive through mere lustful dreams or by bathing in the wrong moonlight. Entire treatises were written by monks who had never kissed anyone but swore they knew exactly what caused impure thoughts. And speaking of monks, historians still debate whether their obsession with female chastity was more about control or fear. After all, nothing frightened the medieval church more than a woman who knew her own mind and her own body. Sometimes, though, women carved out tiny moments of autonomy. Maybe a secret tryst in a stable, a love letter hidden in the lining of a dress, a song hummed in the kitchen with a wink that meant more than the lyrics let on. These were rebellions, quiet, intimate, and mostly invisible to history. And let's not forget, women weren't just judged for having sex, they were judged for not wanting it too. If a wife refused her husband, she could be beaten or sent to a church court. Consent wasn't even a concept. The only person who really could withhold consent was God, and he rarely spoke up in time. The medieval bedroom was not romantic. It was a negotiation table, a confessional, a courtroom, and sometimes a battlefield. Every decision could tip the scales of a woman's future. You might be wondering if love ever blossomed in such a climate. It did, just quietly, secretly, illegally even. But you'll see more of that in part 2. For now, imagine the last candle flickering out. The woman in the corner bed pulls the scratchy wool blanket up to her chin. Outside, the wind moans through cracks in the wood. Somewhere in the dark, a man turns over and reaches for her. She doesn't move. She can't say no. And that's how another night passes behind closed doors. Section 2. You wake up before dawn, not because you want to, but because that's when medieval life demands it. The rooster hasn't even cleared his throat, but the house is already moving. Wood creaking, coals hissing, someone coughing in the dark. You're not a noble, not a nun, not even married yet. You're a girl, and today is just another day of proving you're still pure. Virginity isn't a concept, it's a currency, and you're its very unwilling banker. In the medieval world, a girl's worth was measured not in talents or thoughts, but in how tightly her knees stayed shut before the wedding night. Families treated it like a treasure chest, guarded, prized, and, yes, eventually sold. That sounds harsh, but let's not sugarcoat it. Marriages were mostly transactions, and virginity was the most valuable part of the deal. Dowries depended on it. Honor clung to it like mildew to old wood. But how do you prove something so invisible? Enter the bloodstained sheet. Yes, the infamous tradition of post-wedding inspection. After the big night, your family, and sometimes your husband's entire village, expected physical proof of your virtue. A red stain, a white sheet made uncomfortably public. Sometimes it was paraded through town, other times it was shown discreetly to elders. Either way, it was weird, and kind of horrifying. And what if there was no blood? Well then, you had to get creative. Some girls pricked their fingers, some used chicken blood, rabbit liver, or even dye. One story tells of a bride who hid a dead mouse in her bed just in case something dramatic was needed. She thought quick on her feet, at least. Here's a solid historical fact. In parts of southern France and Italy, virginity inspectors were called in before the wedding night to examine a girl's body. These were often older women, midwives, or, brace yourself, priests. Medieval gynecology was basically a mix of curiosity and cruelty. And yet, it wasn't just about the body. There was a whole performance around innocence. You had to act like you didn't know anything. Not what a kiss was, not what a man wanted, not what your own body even did. If you smiled at a boy, people whispered. If your dress was too tight, they stared. If your hips had the audacity to exist, someone somewhere prayed for your soul. There's a great little off-topic oddity for you. Some medieval medical writers believed that if a woman rode a horse too fast, she could lose her virginity. Imagine your reputation ruined just because you enjoyed a trot through the countryside. And while we're at it, let's talk about the hymen. Today we know it's just a bit of tissue that doesn't always tear, doesn't always bleed, and certainly doesn't always mean anything. But back then, it was sacred or satanic, depends on who you asked. The idea was that the hymen was a gate, and once opened, well, good luck ever closing it again. Historians still debate whether society really believed in the magical power of the hymen or if it was just a convenient myth. Probably both. One thing's for sure, a lot of pain, shame, and tragedy has come from trying to preserve something that doesn't even mean what people think it means. And the pressure wasn't just from men, other women were often the enforcers. Mothers warned daughters, grandmothers scolded, aunts pinched cheeks and gave sideways looks. There were virtue tests, some involving tight belts, others involving prayer marathons. And the worst part? A girl could do everything right and still be blamed if something went wrong. An assault wasn't just a trauma, it was a scandal for her. There were, of course, women who defied it all. Women who had lovers before marriage, who didn't bleed on the sheets, who ran away with stable boys or kitchen apprentices. Some got away with it, some didn't. But the myth of the untouched maiden persisted. It was easier to believe in than truth. Easier to sell. In wealthier households, the rules got stricter. High-born girls were locked away, literally, in towers, convents, or under constant supervision. They were taught embroidery, manners, and silence. Sometimes they were married off at 12. Other times sent to nunneries until their dowries were ready. Either way, their bodies weren't theirs. They were promises, bargaining chips. One chilling practice involved a chastity belt. You've probably heard of those, metal contraptions locked around the waist to prevent any unauthorized access. But historians still argue whether they were ever really used or just imagined later during the Renaissance. Still, the idea alone tells you something about the culture's obsession with control. Here's the thing. Purity wasn't about you. It was about your father's reputation, your mother's pride, your future husband's ego. You were a pawn and your body was the board. And so you played the part. You lowered your eyes. You walked like your ankles were guilty. You laughed only when spoken to and never too loudly. You wore layers, because showing a collarbone might summon Satan. And every month that passed without a ring on your finger felt like walking a little closer to a cliff, because time was your enemy. The older you got, the less valuable you became. Some girls were wed at 13. By 20, you were considered almost suspicious. People wondered what was wrong with you. Had you done something? Did you have urges? Did you read too much poetry? Funny enough, the answer to that last one might have been yes. Some texts warned that reading love poems could corrupt a girl's thoughts and loosen her morals. Words had power, and so did women who dared to understand them. So imagine you're lying on your straw bed at night. You've done everything right. You've stayed silent, stayed small, stayed good. And yet you wonder, is this all there is? Is my body really just something to hand off like a prize goat? You don't have the answer. You don't even know you're allowed to ask. But tomorrow's another day, another veil to wear, another smile to fake, and soon enough, another wedding night to fear. Section 3. You're kneeling on a cold stone floor, hands folded, lips murmuring the same Latin words you've said since childhood. The chapel is dim, lit only by stained glass light and the flicker of a solitary candle. Outside, birds are chirping. Inside, your priest is talking about sin again. And tonight's featured sin? You guessed it. Sex. Welcome to the medieval church's bedroom rules. Spoiler alert, they're weird, strict, and oddly specific. The church didn't just preach morality, it policed it. Every whisper, every moan, every movement beneath the sheets was theoretically under divine surveillance. And priests were not shy about telling you exactly how and when to sin properly. Sex was supposed to be for procreation only, nothing else. That meant no fun, no curiosity, and definitely no improvisation. Let's start with a historical fact that will make you blink twice. The church issued manuals that rated sexual positions by how sinful they were. Missionary? Acceptable. Anything else? Dangerous. Doggy style was considered demonic. On top? Don't even think about it. In some texts, even sex on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays was frowned upon. That left Mondays? Sometimes. But only if you weren't enjoying yourself. And let's talk about the confessional. Because guess what? Medieval priests asked very detailed questions. How often did you sin with your spouse? In what position? Was there noise? One poor soul wrote about confessing that he once laughed during intercourse. The priest gasped. The man did penance, and he probably never laughed again. You might wonder how priests knew so much about sinful behavior. Historians still debate whether the clergy's obsession was about protecting souls or projecting their own shame. Because, surprise, not all priests were celibate. In fact, some medieval towns had whole neighborhoods where priests' illegitimate children lived openly. The church looked the other way, sometimes, but for women there was no look the other way. If you enjoyed yourself too much, if you flirted, if you wore red, you were suspect. A good woman was quiet, dutiful, and always modest. If you wanted more, pleasure, affection, control, you risked being labelled a temptress, a harlot, or worse. There's a bizarre side fact for you. One 14th century theologian argued that a woman's body heat could make sperm boil and render conception impossible. Imagine being blamed for infertility because your thighs were too warm. And yet, many women did find ways to express desire. Secret love letters scented with herbs, stolen moments in dark corners, whispered promises behind market stalls. These were acts of rebellion, tiny sparks in a world soaked in cold, holy water. You shift back to the noble homes now, where things get even more tangled. Marriages were made for land, not love. And when the candles were blown out at night, it wasn't always a spouse in the bed. Affairs were common, especially among the powerful. But that didn't mean they were safe. Women caught in adultery could be punished in cruel ways. Shaved heads, public beatings, forced pilgrimages. Men, a fine, maybe, if they were unlucky. The church pretended to condemn all sin equally, but we both know that wasn't true. And yet, the same institution that demonized female desire also worshipped virgins, specifically one virgin. The Virgin Mary was the ultimate ideal, pure, silent, beautiful, and utterly non-sexual. Women were expected to aspire to that impossible standard, while somehow still fulfilling their wifely duties. Talk about a mixed message. Convents offered some an escape from this contradiction. Not much, but some. Nuns took vows of chastity, yes, but some also found community, education, and even occasional joy. But we'll get deeper into that in part 13. Back in your average village, though, things stayed complicated. A woman might confess impure thoughts to a priest who had no idea what it felt like to live in her skin. Her penance? Hours of prayer, fasting, and maybe kneeling on dry peas. Yes, dry peas. Imagine the crunching under your knees as your guilt gets measured in bruises, and the guilt ran deep. The church taught that women were naturally more sinful. It wasn't just Eve's fault, it was yours. Every temptation, every fall, every slip of a man's mind was laid at your doorstep. You wore it like a second skin. Still, the hypocrisy hung in the air like incense. Behind monastery walls, scandals brewed. One abbot kept a mistress in his wine cellar. Another monk was caught with 3 lovers and blamed it on a demon. Apparently, medieval demons were very proactive. But you? You couldn't blame anything. Your dreams were sinful. Your curves were sinful. Even your hair, uncovered and loose, was sinful. It was said to ensnare men's souls. So you braided it, covered it, bound it. You tried to disappear. Even in marriage, things weren't safe. If you asked for affection, you were shamed. If you didn't produce sons, you were pitied or replaced. And heaven help you if you confessed to not enjoying the act. Medieval medicine claimed that a woman needed to orgasm to conceive, yet also believed that a woman who wanted to orgasm was dangerous. Make that make sense. So every night, you prayed. Not just for forgiveness, but for strength, to be good, to be invisible, to be loved without consequence. But there was always a part of you hidden deep, maybe behind your ribs, that wanted to know what it felt like to want. Without fear, without shame, just to exist as a body, not a burden. That part of you, it stayed quiet, but it never disappeared. Section 4. You wipe your hands on your apron, not because they're clean, just less dirty than the rest of you. It's early afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs just enough to bake the mud into your boots, and the smell of livestock becomes part of your skin. You're a peasant girl, and this is your life. Churn the butter, milk the goat, mind your younger siblings, avoid eye contact with married men. Easy, right? If you're lucky, you'll be invisible. If you're not, you'll be noticed. And that's when things get complicated. Peasant women in medieval Europe didn't have pamphlets about sexuality or time to reflect on inner desires. They had aching backs, calloused hands, and the constant balancing act between modesty and marriageability. But sex? Oh, it was still there, woven into the gossip at the well, the glances at market stalls, the creaks of wooden floorboards at night. Just never spoken aloud. And here's something real. In many villages, women were expected to marry by age 15, some even younger. The idea wasn't romance, it was survival. Marriage meant one less mouth for your parents to feed and one more pair of hands to till the earth or patch the roof. But let's not pretend marriage was some kind of safety net. Once you were wed, your body became someone else's right. If your husband wanted sex, you gave it. If you didn't want to, well, too bad. Refusal wasn't just frowned upon, it was cause for punishment. Some church courts even mandated bed-sharing schedules, just to make sure no one slacked off in the holy business of procreation. And if you became pregnant, which, let's face it, you probably did, you didn't stop working. You hauled firewood with a swollen belly, squatted in the field to give birth, cut the umbilical cord with a scythe if needed, and went back to tending sheep before the baby even stopped crying. Here's the odd side fact of the day. Some midwives used beer as an anesthetic during childbirth. Not exactly an epidural, but hey, at least it took the edge off. And what about unmarried peasant girls? Their lives were even more precarious. Flirting too boldly could ruin you. A reputation for being loose followed you like a bad smell. You'd get nicknames whispered behind your back: hedgerow girl, goose talker, or worse. It didn't take much. One laugh too loud, one too long glance, one walk home in the wrong direction. Yet, desire still bloomed. Sometimes a boy gave you a ribbon. Sometimes you lingered too long by the bread oven just to feel the warmth of someone's arm brush yours. These tiny moments were everything. Brief, dangerous gifts. In some communities, there was even a strange sort of loophole. Bundling. That's when a boy and a girl could lie together, fully clothed or even sewn into sacks, to talk all night without touching. It was meant to encourage intimacy without sin. Guess how well that worked? Yeah, exactly. Historians still debate whether bundling was a genuine effort to allow romance or just a practical way for rural folks to test compatibility. Either way, it tells you how little space there was for open affection. Everything was coded, hushed, veiled in propriety and fear. And if you slip, if you got pregnant out of wedlock, the consequences were brutal. You might be forced into marriage with the father if he stuck around. If not, your family might cast you out. Some towns had stocks for fornicators. Others made women wear marked garments, letters stitched in shame. A few were paraded through the streets, bell in hand, forced to confess to every passer-by. Can you imagine being 16 and ringing a bell to admit your sin to an entire village? And yet men, they walked away, often, literally, no bell, no stocks, maybe a slap on the wrist if the girl's father was well connected. Justice, it seems, wore a very heavy bias. Back in your cottage, you listen to the fire crackle while your mother sings softly, trying to hush a colicky baby. She was married at 13, had her first child at 14, and now looks twice her age by 30. Her body bears the story of every pregnancy, every hardship, every night she lay beside a man she didn't choose. She doesn't talk about pleasure or love or choice. Not because she's repressed, but because she was never given the language. Still, there are cracks in the wall. Women gather at the well to share news, but also warnings. Don't trust that miller's son. The widow near the edge of town knows herbs that help bring on your moon. Sometimes laughter bubbles up, laughter that defies how heavy life is. And in those rare, stolen moments, you sense something ancient and fierce, solidarity. There's a powerful kind of knowledge passed from one woman to the next. It's not written down, it's whispered over bread, hummed between chores, passed through looks. A sisterhood built not from theory, but survival. So tonight, you lay on your straw mattress, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. Your feet are cracked, your back aches, and your hands smell like onions and sheep. But your heart? It's still beating its quiet rhythm beneath all the layers of labor and silence. You wonder what life might be if you could choose who to touch, when to laugh, how to say yes, or more importantly, how to say no. It's a dream maybe, but you hold it close anyway, like a prayer no one taught you, but you somehow know by heart. Section 5. You're standing at the edge of a polished stone corridor, your shoes softer than you're used to, your breath caught in your throat. This isn't the muddy village square or the smoky corner of a peasant's hut. This is a castle, and here things smell like lavender, ink, and danger disguised in poetry. Welcome to the world of noblewomen, where the gowns are heavy, the rules are heavier, and love has to wear a mask. You were taught from the moment your hair was pinned up that your body wasn't yours. It belonged to alliances, titles, dowries, treaties, anything but you. Marriage was a political strategy and romance was an inconvenience. So how did desire survive in such a world? It slipped through in coded letters and glances over goblets of wine. Welcome to the era of courtly love, where the poems were sweet, but the risks were bitter. Here's your historical reality check. Many noblewomen were married off between the ages of 12 and 15. Their husbands were often decades older. And sex? It wasn't the stuff of candlelight and harp music. It was expected, scheduled, and, let's be honest, rarely consensual. And yet, amid all this control, something strange happened. Knights began writing poetry. Troubadours started singing songs. Courtly love was born, an elaborate, performative form of flirtation between married ladies and men who were not their husbands. It wasn't about consummation, well, officially. It was about longing, worship, devotion from afar. The kind of safe distance that made wanting more bearable. The lady would drop a handkerchief. The knight would vow to win a tournament in her name. She'd sigh dramatically from a balcony. He'd write verses comparing her eyes to stars and her lips to crushed pomegranate seeds. It was emotional armor in a world where physical affection could get you killed. Of course, not everyone kept it chaste. Some affairs did cross that invisible line. And when they did, oh, the fallout was spectacular. Imagine this. You're the wife of a lord off at war. His squire is handsome, always lingering a moment too long when handing you scrolls. One evening, you linger too. Maybe it's a kiss. Maybe it's more. Then a servant sees whispers spread. The punishment? That brings us to one of the juiciest documented scandals. Marguerite de Bourgogne, Queen of France, was imprisoned in a tower for adultery, alongside her alleged lovers, who were tortured and executed, all while her royal husband quietly annulled the marriage and moved on. But here's the odd twist. Sometimes noble husbands knew about the affairs, sometimes they didn't care. As long as the woman was discreet and the child looked enough like him, everyone could save face. It was a game of illusion, performed with silks and shadows. Still, the line between fantasy and scandal was razor thin. A poem could turn into a prison sentence. A love letter could be used as evidence in court. Some women kept coded diaries, others burned their notes as soon as they read them. Paper was passion and peril. Historians still debate whether courtly love was ever real, or just a literary invention to let men feel chivalrous and women feel seen. But regardless, it gave noblewomen something, a script, a secret, a sense of being desired, not for their dowry, but for their smile. Of course, pleasure wasn't a guarantee. Some noblewomen described sex with their husbands as mechanical, painful, and humiliating, a duty performed with closed eyes and clenched teeth. Others, more lucky or more daring, found moments of affection in all the wrong places. A travelling bard, a foreign ambassador, a lady-in-waiting. Yes, her too. The heart wants what the law doesn't recognize. Now remember our callback from earlier, that bit about blood-stained sheets? In noble courts, the stakes were even higher. The marriage had to be consummated to be valid. If a bride couldn't prove it, she might be sent back to her family in disgrace, or worse, accused of deception and punished accordingly. There's even a wild historical tidbit for you. In 15th century Aragon, there were court-appointed bed witnesses who verified a marriage's consummation by inspecting the sheets and the noises. Imagine trying to get romantic with someone knocking on the wall, shouting, "Louder, please, it's for legal purposes." But perhaps the most heartbreaking part, these women were often deeply lonely, locked in towers, surrounded by servants they couldn't trust, husbands they barely knew, and rules they could never break without shattering their entire lives. Love, if it existed, had to sneak in like moonlight, silent, fleeting, often invisible. Still, some carved out power in their own ways. A wink here, a delay there, a carefully planned visit to the garden at dusk. Some wrote their own poetry under false names. Some even hosted salons disguised as embroidery circles where literature and passion stirred beneath the needle and thread. Because no matter how tightly you lace the bodice, the heart doesn't always stay where it's told. And so tonight, you lie in your curtained bed of velvet and down beside a man who smells like dust and diplomacy. You turn your face to the wall and dream not of dragons or princes, but of a hand brushing yours, of a laugh in the stables, of someone who looks at you and doesn't see a title, but a woman, just a woman. Section 6. You push open the warped wooden door, and the smell hits you first, sweet, sour, and unmistakably human. The flicker of low lamps barely cuts through the haze of sweat and perfume. This isn't a church, a castle, or a cottage. This is a brothel, and it's legal. Well, sort of. In many medieval cities, sex work wasn't just tolerated, it was regulated. A brothel could have an owner, taxes, inspectors, and a working schedule. It was business. And like most businesses, it operated on a strange mix of exploitation, survival, and uncomfortable necessity. Let's start with a clear historical fact. In 14th century London, the Bishop of Winchester personally licensed several brothels in Southwark. The workers there were called Winchester geese. And yes, people knew exactly what kind of goose you were talking about. So what was it like to be one of those women? You probably didn't choose it. Maybe your father died and your dowry vanished. Maybe you were orphaned, widowed, cast out, or just unlucky. You walked the streets long enough to learn that hunger and cold don't wait for virtue to feed you. A madam gave you a bed and a price. You took both. The rooms were small, usually nothing more than a mattress stuffed with straw and a chipped ceramic basin. Privacy was a luxury. A curtain was good enough. Customers ranged from lonely merchants to bored knights. They paid quickly, left faster. If they didn't, the madam handled it. Sometimes with words. Sometimes with a knife. You learned to act. To smile when your stomach churned. To flirt when you wanted to scream. You learned which clients were talkers, which liked to pretend they were in love, which didn't want you to look them in the eye. You kept secrets because you had to. But here's the strange thing. Within these brothels, women sometimes had more autonomy than wives. Shocking, right? You could make your own money. You didn't answer to a husband. You made decisions. Small, fragile ones, but real. Still, freedom came at a price. Disease ran rampant. Protection was a dream. Condoms were made from linen soaked in chemicals or dried animal intestines. And yes, they often didn't work. In fact, some women used potions made from wild plants, mercury, or even ground-up beetles to try to prevent pregnancy. Spoiler, those came with side effects, like death. There was also surveillance. Cities sent out health inspectors to examine the women regularly. Sounds clinical, but it wasn't. These were crude, invasive, and often humiliating procedures performed by men who probably visited the same women privately. Hypocrisy with a side of candlelight. And what happened if you got too old, too sick, too defiant? You were cast out, no pension, no home, just the street again. Some ended up in leper colonies, others in convents that doubled as prisons. A few survived by becoming madams themselves, taking in new girls, trying to make the system work for them, knowing full well it never really would. Historians still debate whether brothels were a necessary evil or a tool of patriarchal control wrapped in economic convenience. What's clear is that the church officially condemned them, while unofficially using them. Some monasteries bordered brothel districts. Coincidence? Sure. And here's your oddball trivia of the night. In 13th century France, some brothels had a pricing menu carved into the wall, with fees depending on room size, time of day, and specific services. Medieval capitalism, everybody. Not all sex work happened in brothels, though. Some women worked independently in alleys, near markets, under bridges. These women were far more vulnerable. They risked beatings, theft, even murder. They had no protection, no shelter, and no one to care if they disappeared. Still, some became urban legends, like La Belle Hélène of Paris, said to be so charming that even clergymen risked excommunication for a night with her. Or Red Joan of York, who allegedly operated a one-woman network of spies disguised as courtesans. Whether true or not, their stories whisper of women carving control from chaos. But make no mistake, these lives were hard. Romanticized by poets, demonized by preachers, they lived in the cracks of society. Not accepted, not protected, yet necessary, always. At night, the brothel quieted. The laughter faded. Perfume turned to sweat. You'd lie on your back, staring at the wooden ceiling, trying not to think too hard. Maybe you tucked away a few extra coins. Maybe you dreamed of leaving. Maybe you counted how many more nights until your body stopped being your only currency. Outside, the city moved on. The bells rang for matins. Priests muttered prayers. Wives turned over in their beds. But here, in the dark, you were still awake, still waiting, still hoping for something softer in a world made of stone. Section 7. You're kneeling in a pew so cold it could blister your knees, staring up at a stained glass window of a woman with her eyes raised to heaven, arms folded neatly, lips closed forever. She's perfect, and perfectly unreachable. Her name is probably something like Agnes or Claire, or, if the church was feeling ambitious, Mary. She's a saint, or maybe a warning. You're not sure anymore. Tonight, we enter the twisted duality medieval women lived with. Be a saint or be a sinner with no space in between. Because in the eyes of the church, women were either vessels of purity or agents of temptation. There was no middle ground. 1 minute you're lighting a votive candle for your grandmother. The next, you're getting side-eyed by a monk because your ankles are visible. Here's your solid historical fact. In some medieval theological texts, women were described as the gateway to the devil. That's right. The female body was believed to be so dangerously seductive it could cause a man to sin just by existing. Cover your hair, walk small, speak rarely, and if that didn't work, well, your soul was probably already doomed. But women didn't just absorb guilt. They were used as symbols. When the church wanted to talk about lust, they told stories about Eve, or Jezebel, or Bathsheba. Always a woman, always her fault. Sin had hips and a neckline, and yet they also turned women into saints. Not because they lived perfect lives, but because they suffered so perfectly. Martyrs who were tortured, burned, or beheaded because they refused marriage or preserved their virginity. Pain became a pathway to holiness. If you wanted to be admired, you had to suffer first. Think about that. Holiness, for women, was often tied to how well they could endure violence without complaining. But what about women who were too holy? Who saw visions, heard voices, or dared to speak? Now that was dangerous. Take Marjorie Kempe, an English mystic who claimed to speak directly with Jesus. She wept constantly, wore white, and insisted on preaching, even though women weren't allowed to. Church officials tried to silence her again and again. One bishop even accused her of heresy. She survived, but just barely. All considered Joan of Arc, a teenage girl who heard saints, wore armor, led an army, and was burned alive for it. Historians still debate whether her execution was about her politics, her power, or the sheer terror she inspired in a world that wasn't ready for a girl in plate mail. Because here's the thing, a woman who said God spoke to her. That was fine if she stayed quiet. But if she acted on it, that made her dangerous. And the church had no room for dangerous women. Odd fact of the night, some saints' relics, bones, teeth, even bits of skin, were ground into powder and sold as aphrodisiacs. Imagine taking a pinch of some holy lady's kneecap and stirring it into your wine before bed. The logic? Her purity would make you more potent. Medieval science at its finest. Now let's talk about scapegoats. Because for every woman turned into a stained glass icon, there were hundreds blamed for things they didn't do. A cow died. Must be the widow next door. Crops failed. Maybe the midwife gave someone the evil eye. It didn't take much. A mole in the wrong place, a curious gaze, a reputation. And you better believe sex was involved. A woman who lived alone, suspicious. One who didn't remarry after her husband died, definitely hiding something. One who used herbs or knew how to ease childbirth pains. probably a witch. And what do witches do? They seduce men, of course. Even the demons in hell were apparently helpless before the wiles of a strong-willed woman with good posture. You couldn't win. If you were too pretty, you were tempting. If you were too pious, you were proud. If you were smart, you were suspicious. And if you dared to enjoy your body, God help you. Still, women found ways to claim space. They led prayer circles. They copied texts. Some became anchoresses, religious women, sealed in small stone cells attached to churches where they could meditate for life. Imagine choosing to live in a closet-sized room for the rest of your days just to avoid the noise of the world. Even then, rumors crept in. One anchoress was accused of passing notes to a man through the cracks in her wall. Whether true or not, it tells you something. No matter how holy you tried to be, suspicion never left you alone. So tonight, as you walk back from Vespers in the biting wind, head covered, hands folded, you wonder, is it better to be silent and safe, or seen and scorched? Because being a saint might protect your soul, but being human, that might cost you everything. Section 8. You crouch low in the corner of a smoke-filled cottage, not from fear, but from fascination. A woman kneels by the fire, grinding herbs with the flat of her knife, humming a tune older than the village. She smells like rosemary and sharp vinegar. Her fingers are stained green. Her name? Everyone just calls her the midwife. She knows things no priest will ever understand. Tonight, we enter the secret, stubborn world of midwives and women's knowledge. The quiet science passed down mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, in whispers and hands-on lessons. In a time when most women couldn't write, this was survival. Memorized remedies, moon-based timing, stories wrapped in rhymes to remember when to cut the cord and when not to. Here's your firm historical fact. In medieval Europe, midwives were responsible not just for childbirth, but also for contraception, abortion, and women's troubles. They were the first line of defense against death in a world where doctors didn't speak your language or care much if you survived. And they worked in silence because the church didn't like them. See, midwives occupied an awkward space, useful but suspicious. They handled blood, birth, and female bodies, territories men wanted to control but couldn't enter without making things worse. So the church tolerated them, until it didn't. Some midwives were accused of witchcraft, especially if a birth went badly. Others were forced to swear oaths of loyalty like, "I will not use magic, I will not speak charms, I will not cause miscarriage unless absolutely necessary." Wink, wink. Still, knowledge flowed. Midwives used plants like pennyroyal, mugwort, or ergot to bring on or prevent pregnancy. Some worked, some didn't. Some caused seizures, but what else did you have? When a nobleman's wife miscarried, she got a priest. When a peasant girl bled for days, she got a midwife and a boiled rag. And let's talk about birth itself. Forget hospitals. You gave birth in your bed, or on a wooden stool with a hole in it, your neighbors holding your arms while someone fed you wine laced with poppy seeds. If you were lucky, the baby came fast. If not, the midwife used her hands, sometimes a hook, and prayers that blurred into chants. The death rate? High. But so was the determination. Odd fact of the night, some midwives tied iron keys or knives under a laboring woman's bed to cut the pain or unlock the womb. Call it symbolic magic or early therapy. Either way, it shows how desperate and clever people could be when facing death head-on. Midwives also baptized babies when they thought the priest wouldn't arrive in time. This was technically illegal, but if a baby died unbaptized, it couldn't go to heaven. So what do you think they did? They baptized anyway, quietly. with spring water, a whispered prayer, and all the courage in the world. Historians still debate whether these women should be seen as medical pioneers or outlawed mystics, but really, they were both. They didn't wear robes or hold titles, but they held lives literally in their hands. And their role didn't end at birth. They helped with miscarriages, menopause, and menstrual struggles. Men didn't want to hear about any of those things, so women handled them alone, together. Some even ran women's houses, the private spaces where girls went to recover, hide, or sometimes terminate a pregnancy. Risky? Yes. Illegal? Technically. But again, what were the options? If a man got a woman pregnant and denied it, she needed more than a confession. She needed peppermint leaves, old towels, and someone who wouldn't flinch. That was the midwife. Being useful didn't mean being safe. When times got hard, plague, famine, war, the finger pointed fast. She gave me a bad tea. She whispered to the storm. She touched the baby wrong. Midwives became scapegoats. Trials were held, confessions forced, and sometimes they were burned. And yet, they never stopped. In cellars, attics, and side kitchens, they kept helping. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was brave. Maybe it was both. Here's a callback for you. Remember those noblewomen we met in Part 5, stuck in cold marriages? Some of them secretly hired midwives, not just for births, but for contraception. Yes, even queens tried to prevent pregnancies, because back then, getting pregnant wasn't just a blessing, it was a political time bomb. Midwives knew how to time intimacy around the moon, how to mix herbs into honey, how to clean wounds, comfort grief, and handle bodies no one else wanted to touch. They weren't saints, they weren't sinners, they were necessary. So tonight, as you slip under your blanket, imagine the midwife walking home beneath a crescent moon. Her basket is lighter, but her mind is heavy. She helped a woman today. She saved a baby. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe she held someone's hand while they died. Either way, she'll be back tomorrow. Because that's what women did. Not for glory, not for gold, but because no one else would. Section 9. You're staring at your reflection in a rippling bucket of water, adjusting the scarf that hides your hair and your identity. Tonight, you won't be a wife, or a widow, or a weaver. Tonight, you're dressing like a man. Breeches instead of skirts. Rough boots instead of slippers. A cloak pulled low. Not for fashion, for freedom. Welcome to the world of cross-dressers, escape artists, and gender outlaws of the Middle Ages. Women who rewrote the rules just by changing their clothes. Let's set the record straight with a historical fact. Cross-dressing wasn't unheard of in medieval Europe. It was illegal, yes, but that didn't stop women from doing it, especially when it meant escaping a life they didn't choose. Some did it to flee bad marriages, others to walk safely on the road without being harassed. A few joined armies disguised as men, and once, in a blue moon, someone pulled it off long enough to become something bigger. A sailor, a soldier, even a knight. Not just wearing trousers, but rewriting their story. Think of Eleanor Reichner, one of the most fascinating and mysterious cases in 14th century London. Caught in a scandal involving cross-dressing, sex work, and gender confusion, Eleanor's story still baffles historians. Was Eleanor a trans woman, a survivalist, a provocateur? Records show she worked both as a woman and under a male name, John. It's messy, it's brilliant, it's real. Historians still debate how many Johns were actually Joans. And that uncertainty is part of the point. People blurred lines long before modern labels existed. It wasn't always political. Sometimes it was just safer. And safety was everything. A lone woman on a road was a target. A lone man was left alone. That's the thing about clothing. It was language. In a world where women weren't allowed to speak freely, dress became their vocabulary. A tunic could mean strength. A belt could say, "Don't touch me." A haircut could whisper rebellion. But it wasn't just about gender, it was about roles. Some women dressed like monks to join monasteries, others posed as pilgrims or traveling healers to reach places forbidden to them. A few pretended to be mute so they wouldn't have to explain themselves. Medieval improv, survival edition. Here's your odd fact of the night. In some towns, a woman caught wearing men's clothing could be punished by having her head shaved and being paraded through the street, unless she claimed she was doing it for religious reasons. Then it became a holy disguise, the hypocrisy thick as goat stew. But even holy cross-dressing had limits. Take Joan of Arc, remember her? The teenage girl who led armies and was executed not just for heresy, but specifically for refusing to take off her male clothing. Her trial transcripts mention it again and again, as if a pair of pants could threaten the entire Catholic Church. And maybe they could. Because what these women represented, whether intentional or not, was possibility. That the world could be reshaped, that expectations could be shrugged off like a cloak. That a body could belong to its occupant, not its label. Sometimes the disguise wasn't even about leaving, it was about staying. A merchant's wife might dress like her husband and run the shop while he was away. An unmarried woman might wear more masculine styles to signal independence. These weren't just costumes, they were declarations. Of course, not everyone applauded. Neighbors talked, priests panicked. And yet, the Church had its own gender-fluid history. Saints like St. Wilgefortis, a bearded virgin crucified because she refused to marry a king, blurred lines in ways that made theologians squirm. Some said it was a miracle. Others said it was a warning. But the stories kept surfacing. In England, a woman passed as a man for years and even married a woman before being discovered. In France, a female troubadour performed dressed as a man to avoid scandal. In Germany, a convent was once found to have a member who had secretly been a man all along. Surprise twist, the nuns voted to let him stay. What these stories reveal isn't always clean or easy. Some were brave. Some were desperate. Some were just trying to survive one more day in a world that never gave them the benefit of the doubt. And yet for a moment, under that tunic, behind that hood, they could walk with shoulders back. They could travel without fear. They could choose. That's the word, isn't it? Choice. So tonight, as you hang up your apron and smooth down the borrowed cloak, you let yourself imagine what it would be like to walk into the tavern as someone else, to be seen differently, to be spoken to like a person, not a property. Maybe no one will notice, or maybe everyone will, but for tonight, you walk anyway. Section 10. You're sitting alone at the edge of a long wooden table. The fire crackles in the hearth and the stew is cold. No one's poured you a drink. No one dares, because you're a widow now, and that changes everything. Welcome to the double-edged world of widows with power and wives with none, a medieval paradox where losing your husband could finally set you free, and keeping him often meant a lifetime of quiet captivity. Let's get the facts straight. In many parts of medieval Europe, widows had more legal rights than married women. They could inherit property, run businesses, manage estates, and even appear in court without a male representative. That's right, suddenly a woman could exist in public life. All it took was the death of her husband. But don't cheer just yet, because freedom came with conditions. A widow had to mourn, properly. That meant black clothes, no jewelry, and eyes that didn't smile for at least a year. If she remarried too soon, or worse, to a man beneath her status, society sniffed scandal. If she didn't remarry, people whispered about her loneliness, her strangeness, her suspicious independence. Still, many chose not to. Some kept their husband's last name and his business. Some joined guilds or ran inns. Some became moneylenders, one of the few financial roles women could hold. A few even lived entirely alone, answering to no one. And that was terrifying. Not to them, but to everyone else. A woman with no man? That was unnatural, uncontrolled, dangerous. Now contrast that with the married woman. She had no legal identity outside of her husband. Her name didn't appear on documents. She couldn't make contracts. She couldn't own land, not even her own dowry in some regions. Her job: obey, conceive, repeat. If she was beaten? Too bad. Domestic abuse wasn't just tolerated, it was expected, as long as the injuries didn't draw blood. Yes, a common law rule held that a husband could discipline his wife as long as he didn't strike her with a stick thicker than his thumb. You've heard of the rule of thumb? That's one possible origin. Charming, isn't it? And forget divorce. It didn't exist for most people. Only the very wealthy could petition for annulment, and even then, it required proof of non-consummation, adultery, or, brace yourself, impotence. Courts actually had tests for this. Imagine dragging your husband to a public trial to prove he couldn't, well, perform. Dignity went out the window faster than the chamber pot. But back to widows. Here's an odd side note. Some widows in Venice were required to wear red veils for life to mark them as untouchable. You could spot them in a crowd, part reverence, part scarlet letter-style warning. Yet others used their status to become patrons of the arts, founders of hospitals, even political players. One widow in France maintained control over 5 vineyards and a shipping route. Another in Germany acted as the de facto mayor of her town. Nobody dared challenge her. She had money, men on payroll, and no husband to slow her down. Historians still debate whether widowhood was a liberation or a different kind of cage. The truth? It was both. Freedom always came with shadows. A powerful widow was admired, but also feared. She had to walk a careful line. Too soft, she was dismissed. Too strong, she was accused of sorcery. Let's not forget the dark side. If a husband died under suspicious circumstances, the wife was often the first suspect. Some were tried, some were burned, some were simply exiled. Love and loss were too closely intertwined for comfort. And yet, many women still found peace in widowhood. They wrote letters for the first time. They traveled. They read. They made choices. Choices they'd never had the luxury of making before. Meanwhile, the married woman knelt beside the bed, birthing her 12th child in 14 years, her body broken, her voice worn down to silence. She watched her husband eat the last slice of bread and didn't ask for a bite. She thanked him when he allowed her to keep the worn cloak. She prayed for his safety, even when she feared his fists more than the plague. In the eyes of the church, a good wife was obedient, fruitful, and pious. In the eyes of history, she was invisible. Her name rarely recorded, her words never written down. But you, tonight, you light a single candle beside your window. You are a widow now. The air feels different. Your home is quiet. The walls echo, but they no longer watch you. You think about the man you buried. You miss him, maybe, or maybe you don't. Maybe the tears you shed were more about relief than grief. You wouldn't say that aloud, of course, but you let yourself breathe. Just once. Outside, the stars blink, like gossiping neighbors. You draw the shutters closed. You pour yourself a cup of wine. And for the first time in years, you drink it slowly, because no one is waiting to take it from you. Section 11. You flinch at the sound of iron scraping across wood. Someone's being dragged into the village square again. Another punishment. Another whispered name. You don't need to ask what it's for, you already know. Adultery. Tonight, we step into the cold, cruel theatre of adultery. and its strange punishments, a world where who you loved, touched, or merely looked at could earn you chains, shame, or worse. Let's make it plain. The medieval world treated male and female infidelity very differently. A man caught cheating, maybe a fine. A woman? That was scandal, scorn, sometimes even public torture. Love might be blind, but medieval justice was definitely one-eyed and squinting. Adultery wasn't just a moral failing, it was a threat to property, specifically the property line between a man's name and his heirs. If a wife had a child by someone else, that threw everything, land, title, bloodlines, into chaos. So society cracked down, not to protect marriage, but to protect male inheritance. Here's your historical fact. In some parts of medieval Germany and France, adulterous women were forced to walk through town in nothing but their shift, barefoot, with a noose around their neck. Sometimes they were made to ride backwards on a donkey, holding a sign naming their sin. Their lover? Often nowhere to be found. I know that wasn't the worst of it. In parts of Italy, adulterous wives could be legally killed by their husbands, under what's now called honor-killing logic. One law stated that if a man caught his wife in the act, he had the right to kill both her and the lover on the spot. Some even did it and were praised for restoring their family's honor. You don't see that on a wedding invitation. Meanwhile, a cheating husband was seen as unfortunate, maybe a little unruly. His wife could complain, sure, but what could she do about it? Nothing. The church told her to pray, the community told her to be more obedient. And the man? He kept his estate, his name, and probably his mistress. Now here's a strange bit of trivia for you. In some towns, adulterers were punished by being sewn into a sack together and thrown into a river. One sack, two lovers, very little oxygen. Romantic, isn't it? But even when the punishments weren't fatal, they were designed to humiliate. Stocks, branding, public hair shaving. In one documented case, a woman was forced to wear a hat made of chicken feathers and march behind a pig labeled with her lover's name. The crowd laughed. She didn't. And yet, adultery still happened. Often, repeatedly. Passion doesn't care about statutes. Sometimes it was boredom. Sometimes loneliness. Sometimes real, reckless love. A knight sent away for years. A merchant gone for months. A wife aching for affection, drawn to the gardener who actually looked her in the eyes. It's not hard to imagine, is it? But women weren't fools. They knew the risks, so they got clever. Letters were written in code. Lovers met in barns, during festivals, under cover of religious pilgrimage. One noblewoman allegedly wore a hollowed-out prayer book where she hid love notes inside the binding. God bless the multitaskers. Historians still debate whether these women were victims or rebels. The answer, of course, is both. Some were trapped in loveless marriages arranged at age 13. Others were deeply unhappy but still devoted. And some, let's be honest, just wanted what every human wants, to feel chosen. And adultery wasn't always about romance. Sometimes it was a power move, a way to reclaim autonomy. In the brothel district, you paid for control. In the castle, you risked it all for a whisper of freedom. In both places, sex became a kind of rebellion. Here's another callback for you. Remember the bundles and bed-sharing rituals from Part 4? In some communities, those were extended to married women suspected of cheating. Bed trials were performed to test a woman's fidelity. Yes, really. Sometimes by priests, sometimes by midwives, sometimes by people who had no business being involved at all. Privacy? Not invited. And what about forgiveness? Well, it depended on who you were. A noblewoman might be locked in a tower for a year, then quietly reintroduced to society. A peasant woman might be flogged in front of her neighbors. A male noble, of course, could always find another mistress. A male peasant might just vanish and reappear like nothing happened. But some couples did reconcile. Some women begged forgiveness at the feet of a husband they didn't love. Some men took back wives who humiliated them, not because they forgave, but because reputation was easier to repair than loneliness. Still, the fear lingered. Every time you heard the knock of a constable's staff, every time the priest's sermon lingered too long on Eve and her apple, every time a neighbor laughed too loud when your husband left town, you learned to lie with a straight face. You learned to never keep a letter. You learned how to speak with your eyes and not your mouth. And above all, you learned this: never get caught. So tonight, as you pull the shutters closed and bolt the door, you feel the weight of every secret you've never said aloud. Your husband snores, your children sleep, the house is still. But your thoughts? They pace the floor, back and forth, like the heart that still remembers how it felt to be wanted. Section 12. The door bursts open with a howl of wind and fear. Torches flicker outside. Someone's shouting. A dog is barking like it knows something you don't. And you freeze mid-step, your hands covered in flour, or maybe in herbs, or maybe in nothing at all. But it doesn't matter. Tonight, it's you. Welcome to the most terrifying crossroads in medieval womanhood, where healing, independence, and sex all looked a little too much like witchcraft. Let's begin with a historical truth you're not going to love. Tens of thousands of women, most of them poor, old, or simply inconvenient, were accused of witchcraft between the 13th and 17th centuries. Many were tortured, many were executed, almost all were misunderstood. And here's the thing, the accusation of witch wasn't about magic. Not really. It was about power. The power of a woman who didn't need a man. The power of a woman who knew something. The power of a woman who said no. It often started small. You healed someone with an herb the priest couldn't pronounce. You refused a marriage proposal. You lived alone, or worse, you talked about sex, not flirtatiously, not quietly, but with knowledge, maybe even humor. Now you're dangerous. Let's talk about bodies. The church was obsessed with them, especially female ones, and the more they feared them, the more they tried to control them. So what happened when a woman's body didn't play by the rules, when she miscarried, when she had too many children, not enough children, when she dared to age in public? They called her a witch. Here's an odd historical detail. Some witch tests involved shaving a woman's entire body to find the witch's mark, which could be anything from a freckle to a mole to a birthmark. If you flinched when they stabbed it with a needle, you were guilty. If you didn't flinch, you were probably also guilty. It was never about the mark, it was about the accusation. You see, the line between healer and heretic was a razor's edge. Midwives, herbalists, widows, unmarried women, women who talk too much, or not at all. Anyone outside the social mold could become a scapegoat. And the punishment wasn't symbolic. It was fire, it was rope, it was drowning. Take this fact. In some regions of Central Europe, women were submerged in water to see if they floated. If they sank, they were innocent, technically, but they also drowned. If they floated, they were guilty, and then they burned. You can't win a game designed to kill you either way. But why the sudden panic? Historians still debate it. Some say the witch hunts were a way to distract from plague and famine. Others blame the printing press, which spread fear faster than wildfire. And some point to the Reformation, a religious arms race where both Catholics and Protestants tried to prove their holiness by purging sin. Whatever the cause, the victims were mostly women, and the sins were mostly familiar: a sharp tongue, a quiet mind, a strange dream, a sexual appetite, a rejection of authority. Women who had lovers out of wedlock were accused of luring men with demonic magic. Women who didn't want lovers were accused of being possessed. Women who survived childbirth too many times were said to have sold their souls. Women who lost all their children, clearly a curse. It wasn't just fear, it was punishment for refusing to be small. And some embraced the legend. If they were going to be called witches, they might as well keep helping women in secret. One midwife in Bohemia brewed tea that helped with pain and called it moon water to avoid suspicion. Another in the Alps taught girls how to grow mint and mugwort in pouches hidden in their aprons. It was medicine disguised as magic. Still, it wasn't enough, because sooner or later someone got sick. Someone died. Someone's cow gave sour milk. And when the priest asked why, all fingers pointed to the woman who lived too quietly. The one who knew too much. You see it again and again. In town records, in letters, in testimonies, scribbled by men with ink-stained fingers. She seduced me in a dream. She touched a snake. She danced by the river under the moon. And you want to laugh, because women weren't allowed to be anything without suspicion. If you cried, you were emotional. If you didn't, you were cold. If you bled, it was natural. If you bled too much, it was demonic. Even childbirth could be twisted into evil. One case records a woman accused of summoning demons because her child was born breech. The midwife who helped her? Tortured? Confessed? Hanged. There's no happy ending here. Just a grim kind of knowledge that fear of female power, especially sexual power, has deep, twisted roots. So tonight you crouch low in your kitchen, the herbs spilled across the floor, the dog still barking, the torches move past. They're not here for you, not yet. But you feel the air shift. You know how fast a whisper becomes a noose. And in your chest, there's a flicker, not fear, not exactly. Something older, something defiant. Maybe you are a witch. Maybe you always were. Section 13. You press your hand to the cold stone wall and listen, not for danger, but for silence. Real silence, the kind only convents know. The air smells like beeswax and old vellum, like soap and solitude. You've entered the cloister, and behind these thick walls is a world most people never see. The world of the nuns. Forget what you've heard. Not all nuns were saintly, and not all convents were cages. In medieval Europe, becoming a nun was sometimes the only alternative to marriage. If you were a daughter without a dowry, or simply unwilling to wed a man 3 times your age, the convent offered a way out. Not always a happy one, but a way out nonetheless. It wasn't always a free choice. Many girls were donated to the church before they could walk. Some were left at the gates at age 7, handed over like bread, tithed to God. The church called it devotion. Families called it practicality. The girls didn't get to call it anything. But once inside, a strange thing happened. They grew up. And when they did, some found something radical, something dangerously close to freedom. Let's set the record straight with a historical fact. Some convents in the Middle Ages functioned almost like small, self-sufficient cities, complete with gardens, scriptoriums, kitchens, libraries, and even beer breweries. The nuns ran the show. They managed money, copied manuscripts, taught girls, healed the sick, all without a man in sight. Yes, there were prayers. Bells rang every few hours. Silence was expected. Humility was demanded. But behind the chants and psalms, something else lived, a quiet independence. And sometimes something even louder. Because not every nun came to God with pure motives. Some were sent to cover up scandals. Others used the veil as camouflage. There are records of nuns writing poetry about forbidden love. Others traded letters with knights, monks, and even each other. Letters that got spicy, let's just say. Here's your odd fact of the night. In a 12th century German convent, one nun was caught smuggling love notes inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. Imagine biting into your lunch and getting a sonnet instead. Of course, not every convent allowed such creativity. Some were strict to the point of cruelty. Girls were punished for speaking out of turn. Meals were thin. Beds were stone. And once you took your vows, you weren't supposed to leave, ever. But rules are funny things. The stricter they are, the more creative people become about bending them. Historians still debate whether the nun's life was liberating or repressive. It depended on the place, the abbess, the century. In some orders, women debated theology, practiced medicine, and wrote books under their own names, unheard of in the outside world. In others, they were little more than unpaid housekeepers for the church. Some even fought back, politely but effectively. They negotiated with bishops, managed estates. One nun, Hildegard of Bingen, became one of the most famous intellectuals of her time, writing about music, nature, medicine, and yes, visions of glowing figures who looked suspiciously like divine women. And what about the rumours? Oh, there were plenty. That convents were hotbeds of forbidden love. That secret tunnels connected them to monasteries. That babies were born and buried in gardens. That nuns danced under the moonlight, naked, possessed. Were some of them true? Maybe. Most? Probably not. But the existence of the rumours says a lot about society's fear. What happens when women have time, space, and each other? There were scandals, of course. A convent in Italy became infamous for a series of affairs with local priests, documented by neighbours, fueled by jealousy. Another nun was excommunicated for refusing to obey her bishop. Her crime? Running her convent too well. How dare she? But for every scandal, there was a quiet life. A nun tending to sick children. A sister writing a hymn by candlelight. A group of women laughing over soup, glad to not be pregnant for once. Small resistances. Beautiful ones. And some convents became havens, refuge for widows, rape survivors, girls escaping arranged marriages. The cloister, for all its silence, became a shelter from the noise of expectation. Still, it was a life lived in echoes. You might fall in love, but only in your dreams. You might write poems, but hide your name. You might want more, but have no words for it. So tonight, you lie on your straw mattress, wrapped in the quiet, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling. Somewhere down the hall, a bell tolls softly. A sister mutters in her sleep. A wind whistles through the high windows. And for the first time in days, you let yourself think of the outside, of voices and markets and messy kisses in alleys, of sins that felt like sweetness. Then you press your hands together, not in guilt, not in shame, but in memory. Section 14. You're in a tavern now, noisy, smoky, alive with spilled ale and the kind of laughter that says, no one wants to go home yet. A bard plucks at a lute, singing of knights and dragons and damsels in, well, far less distress than the songs admit. A man 2 tables over claims his great-grandmother was seduced by a siren. Someone else swears the queen once turned into a wolf under the full moon. And in the corner, you listen, because stories are power, especially when they're about lust, lies, and the legends that shaped medieval minds. Let's talk about how women's sexuality was mythologized, weaponized, and turned into bedtime stories designed more to control than entertain. Start with Eve. Always Eve, the original villainess in the medieval imagination. She ate the fruit, got humanity kicked out of paradise, and apparently invented lust all by herself. Forget the serpent, forget Adam, standing there, chewing. This was her sin. From there, the pattern only got more theatrical. Historical fact, medieval sermons warned that a woman's gaze alone could boil the blood and lead men into mortal sin. Eye contact? Dangerous. A smile? Practically a trap. Women were seen as temptresses by default, and the further the story travelled from the truth, the more it stuck. That's why stories of femme fatales flourished. The Lady of the Lake, alluring but untrustworthy. Morgan Le Fay, smart but conniving. Even Mary Magdalene was twisted into a reformed harlot, though the Bible never actually says she was one. And of course, there were the succubi, female demons who seduced men in their sleep and stole their seed. Entire treatises were written about them. One 15th century manual claimed succubi entered bedrooms through keyholes or cracks in the wall. Imagine blaming your dream on a demon because you woke up in a cold sweat. But while men feared them, they also wanted them. That's the real heart of it. Medieval men were raised to be both terrified of women and utterly obsessed with them. They wrote about their hair as ropes, their lips as poison, their hips as gates to both heaven and hell. And women? Well, they read those stories too. Some believed them, some laughed at them, some wrote their own. Take the troubadour tradition. While mostly male, a few bold women wrote love poems too, full of longing, flirtation, and yes, desire. They didn't ask permission, they rhymed with hunger. Here's your offbeat fact for the night. A 12th century female poet named Castellosa wrote a verse where she accuses a man of playing hard to get, and then threatens to leave him for someone more vital. You go, girl. Still, the dominant stories weren't so kind. There were tales of women who turned men into donkeys. Women who used potions to trap lovers. Women whose beauty literally killed. These weren't just spooky fireside fables. They shaped how real women were treated. If you were too beautiful, you were cursed. Too plain, you were useless. Too smart, too forward, too bold, always too something. A woman who spoke her mind might be called a shrew. One who didn't might be labelled cold, and if she enjoyed sex, surely she must have made a deal with the devil. The church played along, of course. Religious art often showed women being saved from their carnal ways, saints trampling temptation, martyrs bleeding for purity. Meanwhile, folk culture told stories about lusty nuns and naughty milkmaids. The contradiction wasn't a bug, it was a feature.
Because all those legends, they weren't about truth, they were about control.
If you tell a girl that her body is dangerous, she might try to hide it. If you tell a boy that a woman's laughter means seduction, he might take more than he should. These myths built a world where female sexuality was a joke, a curse, a mystery, but never hers to own. And yet, beneath the layers of folklore, women told their own stories. Around fires, in sewing circles, at the well. They talked about lovers who left, babies born from moonlight trysts, kisses stolen in fields of rye. These stories didn't get written down, but they lived in lullabies, in herbal recipes, in knowing glances passed between sisters. Historians still debate how much we've lost, how many stories never made it past a whisper. But we know this. Women imagine themselves into legends, even if no one wrote them as heroes. So tonight, as the tavern grows quieter and the lute fades into a sleepy hum, you lean back against the stone wall. A woman nearby tells a joke about St. Agnes and a wandering monk. Someone snorts ale through their nose. The fire crackles. A child dozes in someone's lap. You think of all the stories that brought you here, the lies, the warnings, the little truths stitched into myths. And you wonder what legends will be told about you. Section 15. You're sitting on a worn wooden bench in the back of an empty chapel. The candles are low, the windows fogged with breath and rain. Outside, the world is still turning. Horses clop down muddy roads, babies cry, bread bakes, secrets are whispered. But in here, in this stillness, all you can hear are the things that never made it into the ledgers, the chronicles, the books. This is where the journey ends, not in triumph or tragedy, but in quiet. Because tonight we listen to the things we'll never know about medieval women and the lives they carried in silence. Let's be honest, most of history's record keepers were men, monks with quills and opinions, priests with parchment and agendas, kings with scribes who documented war, property, and glory, but rarely a woman's name unless she married the right person, bore the right son, or committed the right scandal, which means most women. They're gone, not buried, but vanished. No headstones, no signatures, just traces, fingerprints on pottery, strands of hair woven into old clothing, the faded ghost of initials scratched onto the underside of a spinning wheel. Even the ones we think we know, Hildegard, Eleanor, Joan, are built from fragments shaped by later writers who decided which parts of their lives to preserve and which to conveniently forget. We don't know how they laughed, or what perfume they wore, or how they said "I love you" when no one else was around. Here's a strange but true historical note. In some medieval villages, women's names were recorded only as the wife of, or the daughter of. And when the man died, the record stopped, as if her identity expired with his. And yet, there's something deeply human about what survives in spite of all that. The grooves in a hand-carved comb, the creases in a well-used prayer book, the uneven stitching on a patch sewn in the dark. They aren't famous, but they're real. Historians still debate how much we can trust the sources we have, how many stories were lost, how many were changed to fit a narrative that feared women's agency. But you know what's even more mysterious? How many women chose to remain hidden on purpose? Some wrote letters in code, some passed stories down through lullabies, never meant for parchment. Some buried their desires so deeply even their own daughters didn't find them. Not every silence is oppression. Some silences are armor. And then there are the questions no archive can answer. What did a 15-year-old peasant girl think on the night before her wedding? Did she cry? Did she hope? What did the village midwife whisper to herself when no one was listening? Did the abbess ever fall in love with one of her sisters? Did the woman accused of witchcraft believe in magic or just in herself? What did a widow feel the first time she sat alone in a house she finally controlled? No one wrote it down, but you can feel it in the stillness, in the shadows. Odd fact of the night. There's a medieval manuscript with a doodle in the margin, drawn by a nun, of a woman mooning the reader. Just a but. No explanation. Just a quiet little rebellion that somehow survived 800 years. Imagine all the ones that didn't. So, what do we do with this absence? We remember, we guess, we wonder. We lean in and listen, not for the shouting of kings, but for the whispers between the cracks, for the half-told stories, for the women who stitched their truths into seams and shadows. Tonight, you step out of the chapel and into the cool night. The air smells like rain and moss and a little wood smoke. Somewhere, a dog barks. Somewhere else, a girl dreams about what it would be like to run, barefoot, into the woods and never come back. And you walk home, slow, thoughtful, carrying a story that was never really yours, but now lives in your chest all the same. The candles have burned low now, and the stories have quieted. You've walked through muddy villages, silent convents, echoing castles, and stifling brothels. You've stood beside women who laughed, hid, cried, prayed, whispered, resisted, and vanished. And somehow, you're still here. We've talked about chastity belts and coded love letters, about saints turned sinners and sinners who simply wanted to live. We've met midwives who defied death with a boiled root, nuns who smuggled poems in bread, widows who ruled estates with iron wills, and girls who rode horses too fast. and got blamed for everything. We've seen how the world twisted female sexuality into myth, danger, punishment, and yet never managed to extinguish it. Because no matter how many laws were written, how many sermons delivered, how many names erased, one truth remained. Women found ways to live anyway. They carved out joy in stolen glances. They rewrote rules with needle and thread. They built entire worlds in silence. And sometimes they even laughed, loudly, just to prove they still could. So as your eyes grow heavy and the hum of your thoughts begins to slow, remember that the Middle Ages weren't all shadows and stone. They were also full of breath, warmth, and the kind of stubborn tenderness that refuses to be forgotten. Tonight you've heard their echoes, you've felt their steps behind yours, you've carried their secrets a little farther forward. Now turn off the last light, sink a little deeper into your blankets, let the world hush. You're not alone in the dark, you never were.